Josh. I'm 34 years old and I'm currently a head nurse at the hospital where I work. I feel very happy with my job and what I do. Although I have to tell you that it has cost me a lot of effort to get to where I am, more than you can believe. It has been very difficult, and I always thought that for nothing in the world I would leave what I have achieved. But a little over a year ago, I had a terrifying experience in the hospital where I work, and I was about to quit my position, my job, everything. At that moment, I didn't even give myself the chance to think about it. I just wanted to be far away from there. I remember that when I opened my eyes, I saw the silhouette of that demon woman in the window again. I took off my oxygen mask and the IV. I jumped out of bed and went to the hospital locker. I grabbed what I could of my things from the locker. I got dressed and I almost ran out through the emergency room hallway without turning around even once. I was more than terrified. I couldn't assimilate what had just happened to me, and I didn't know how to handle it. I just wanted to be as far away from there as possible. Dr. Carmen, the head of emergencies and one of my best friends since I arrived at the hospital, came out behind me, and on the ambulance ramp, she reached me by the shoulder. I stopped, but didn't turn around at any time. I was even shaking with fear. Then she stood in front of me and hugged me, while she told me that she did believe me. I didn't understand her words at that moment, but I started to cry. I hugged her very tightly. I didn't understand what was happening, but she kept telling me that everything would be okay. That helped me calm down, little by little. Now calmer, she accompanied me to the avenue to take a taxi. That afternoon, I did not return to work. I called in sick, and the next day, I just showed up with Paquito, the human resources guy, to ask for my vacation. They owed me several days. I hadn't taken them for about 2 years, ever since I separated from Ruben. But this time, I really needed to be away from the hospital, at least until I could assimilate that what had attacked me that horrible night when I suffered cardiorespiratory arrest had been a demon woman. I was able to stay at home for a few days, but it began to happen to me that at dusk, when I went to bed, I would barely close my eyes when that horrible image of that woman's deformed face would come back to me. Sometimes she would appear to me with one deformed eye in its bloody socket, staring at me, and black drool dripping from her mouth, while she would clack her yellow, rotten teeth together, clenching her jaw again and again, producing that horrible sound that pierced my ears. I woke up terrified, bathed in sweat, full of chills, and scared to death, to the point that I could not sleep for 3 days straight. I also began to feel very nauseous and disgusted at mealtimes. My stomach would turn, and I would start to vomit the little I had been able to eat. There came a time when I began to expel blood with phlegm. I really felt very bad. I lost track of time. I barely stayed conscious. They were very difficult days, so much so that I thought that my life would end there. One afternoon, the doorbell at my house began to ring very insistently. I had not ordered takeout for days, and since I had separated from Ruben, no one really visited me. My entire family is from Puebla, so they did not come much. I could barely get out of bed. I felt very dizzy. I had to hold onto the walls wherever I could. The walk was very hard, and that was only a few meters. I barely managed to turn the key and unlock the door, but at that moment my legs buckled. I leaned against the wall next to me and and slowly sat down on the floor while the door slowly opened. When I was able to open my eyes again, I saw the distorted face of Dr. Carmen. I saw it as elongated. I remember that in my dreams, she told me that we would go see a lady who would help me. I didn't quite understand what she was saying. Her voice seemed very far away, and as if it had an echo. He put my arms around his neck, took me by the waist, and helped me up. He practically dragged me to one of the armchairs in my living room, checked my vital signs, and gave me some serum to drink. He also took out a syringe and a small vial from his bag. I guess it was epinephrine or something similar, because as soon as he injected me, I felt like an electric shock throughout my body, and that he was giving my legs and arms strength back, as if they shook off the extreme tiredness I had had all these days. And yet I still felt weak. Right there on the armchair, he helped me change and get ready a bit. She eventually found my house keys, put them in her briefcase, helped me up by my arms. And although I was feeling a little better, the floor was still shaking a little. I was still a little dizzy. We stopped to lock the door, walked down the stairs very slowly. I live on the 4th floor of an apartment building, until we reached the parking lot and headed to her car. She held my arm the whole time, holding me tight so I wouldn't fall. She helped me settle as best she could in the back seat and fastened my seatbelt. I was barely able to stay awake when she started the car. The effort of getting out had completely exhausted me. When I opened my eyes again, we were already in the middle of traffic. I realized it was afternoon. At first, I couldn't figure out where we were going, but after a while, the road became familiar. We were on Ignacio Zaragoza, heading towards the Mexico-Puebla Federal Highway. Dr. Carmen tried hard to keep me awake so I wouldn't lose consciousness again. I tried hard to pay attention, but I had a hard time keeping my eyes open. I remember that she told me about the woman we were going to see, Mrs. Mariana, a very powerful healer, one of the best in the state of Mexico, who knew a lot about what was happening to me, and who would help me, who lived beyond the municipality of Ixtapaluca, a little beyond the town of San Francisco. Dr. Carmen's voice, although I could hear it clearly, still seemed far away. My eyes were very heavy. They were closing. And no matter how hard I tried to keep them open, I couldn't stand it any longer, and I closed them for a moment. By the time I opened my eyes, I was in a very dark room, lit only by a few candles on a small wooden table, which was next to a brazier with glowing embers. I was lying on my side, on a very hard bed. I couldn't move. I still felt weak, but at least I didn't feel dizzy anymore. My mouth was dry and very bitter. At that moment, I felt like my eyes were going to close again. Behind me, I heard Dr. Carmen's voice asking someone if they could help me. There was a long silence. It was frustrating. Then I heard the calm voice of the healer, Mrs. Mariana, to whom I will be eternally grateful, telling Dr. Carmen that things would be difficult because what I had over me was a female demon, and a difficult one at that, because she was the sister of the devil himself. Listening to her, I felt a chill run down my spine. I was horrified by that answer. My whole body began to shake uncontrollably, as if I were very cold. I tried desperately to get up. I wanted to run away from there, but I couldn't even turn my body to see them. I felt so helpless that the only thing I could think of was to pray something, but I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried. I couldn't remember any prayer, not even an Our Father. Nothing. Many years had passed since my mother died when I was 14. But at least thinking about her relieved me a little from the horror of that moment. I wished with all my soul that my mother was here with me, hugging me and telling me that everything was going to be okay. It was enough. I couldn't help it any longer, and my tears ran down my face. I closed my eyes, and then I stopped hearing Mrs. Mariana's voice. But before I continue, let me tell you how all this started. As I told you a while ago, it was a little over a year ago when I had that horrible experience with that demon woman, Ara, as Mrs. Mariana called her. At that time, I had the night shift, and that particular night was quiet despite the fact that it was the second half of November and the weekend. Even so, there were very few admissions to the emergency department, and most of those treated were for apparently minor ailments, nothing serious. Although we did have one very strange case, that of a girl who arrived with convulsions. The curious thing about the matter was that her body, which at times twisted in a very grotesque way, was completely cold, as if she had been lying on ice. However, the thermometer showed about 41 degrees. This situation somewhat disconcerted Dr. Carmen, head of the emergency department. In order to inject her, we had to hold her between 3 colleagues and the doctor. She had a lot of strength in her limbs for her weight and height. After a lot of struggle, we were finally able to stabilize her, but we couldn't get her out of her unconscious state. The doctor decided to send her to intensive care to keep her under observation and get a complete diagnosis. When suddenly, without further ado, the young woman sat up in bed. Almost all of us jumped in fright. She stared at us as if she were very angry with us. She opened her mouth slightly. I thought she was going to speak, but no. Then she began to vomit black, very viscous blood with a horrible smell. She stayed like that for a few seconds. As soon as she finished, she fainted again on the bed. Everyone in the emergency room was paralyzed and silent. During all that time, until Dr. Carmen reacted and approached the girl, placed her head on the pillow, and began to take her vital signs. They seemed stable. The rest of us reacted and rushed to support her. It was shocking, even though we are to a certain extent accustomed to seeing very hard situations every night. But after recovering from the shock, Dr. Carmen asked me to speak with the young people who had brought the girl, to find out what she had consumed that had made her like that. I left the emergency room and approached the boys who were sitting on the benches in the waiting room to ask them what they had given her to drink that had made her so sick. At first, they just looked at each other in silence. I insisted several times with the question. It seemed like no one would say anything until I mentioned that we would turn the case over to the police. That's when one of the girls looked up at me. She seemed somewhere between doubtful and distressed. She looked at the rest of her classmates for a moment and then looked at me again. And with a trembling voice, she told me that they hadn't even taken anything, that they had spent most of the night playing with the Ouija board. I saw that the rest of the young people began to get very nervous. I didn't believe her. The girl fell silent again and lowered her head. I didn't want to insist anymore. I knew that in the laboratory results we would find out what they had consumed. I told them that her friend would stay until tomorrow for observation. that they should tell her family. I turned around and went back to the emergency room. My colleagues had already returned to their areas. Only Dr. Carmen was at her desk, filling out some forms. I sat in front of her and we started to talk about the girl's case. As a joke, I told her that maybe a demon had gotten into the girl, like in the Exorcist movie, because that's what they had been doing all night, playing with the Ouija board. We both started to laugh, but between laughs she told me that she was a little scared by the girl's reactions, that for a moment that thought did cross her mind. Then we started to talk about some of the strange cases that were told about the hospital, stories that some of our colleagues had even experienced firsthand, especially those of us who covered the night shift. Most of these stories agreed that they felt that someone or something was following them in the hallways, or that they were watching them from a distance while they were doing their rounds or attending to their patients. Others said that they saw things moving on tables or stretchers in the hallways, and a few more said that they had even more horrible experiences, such as seeing ghosts wandering through the hallways. Of all these stories that we were talking about, there was one in particular that had a big impact on me, which supposedly had happened to Graciela, the previous head nurse. Dr. Carmen told me that about 3 years ago, the head nurse came to see her in her office around 3 a.m. as part of her rounds, which was quick, and that she barely had time to say hello to her when she had already disappeared in the hallway on the way to the elevator. Dr. Carmen told me that she was already used to seeing her in such a hurry all the time, so she didn't give it much importance and continued with her work, filling out reports in front of the computer, when, about 15 or 20 minutes after Graciela had passed, Jose came rushing into her office. One of the hospital's security guards at the time seemed upset and asked him if he knew where Graciela's boss was. The doctor, somewhat surprised, told him that she was probably on one of the upper floors doing her rounds. Jose barely let her finish when he ran into the hallway towards the elevator without even thanking her. Dr. Carmen found this very strange and went after him, asking him if everything was okay. The guard didn't answer and didn't stop until he was in front of the elevator. Dr. Carmen told me that she was already used to seeing her in a hurry like that all the time, so she didn't give it much importance and continued with her thing, filling out reports in front of the computer when, about 15 or 20 minutes after Graciela had passed, Jose hurried into her office. One of the hospital's security guards at the time seemed upset and asked him if he knew where Graciela's boss was. The doctor, somewhat surprised, told him that she was probably on one of the upper floors doing her patrol. Jose barely let her finish when he ran down the hallway toward the elevator, without even thanking her. Dr. Carmen found this very strange and went after him, asking him if everything was okay. The guard didn't answer and didn't stop until he was in front of the elevator, insistently pressing the button for it to go down, while he tried to communicate via his radio with Mario, the other guard, his partner, who was in the camera monitor room at the hospital entrance. As soon as the elevator doors opened, Jose and Dr. Carmen got in. Then the guard told him that Chief Graciela had contacted them by radio to tell them that she was following a woman who had surely smuggled herself into the hospital because when he called her to ask her what she was doing there, the woman, instead of stopping, started to walk faster. When suddenly they only heard a horrible scream on the radio, and then nothing. They called his cell phone several times, checked the security cameras, and nothing. They had lost her. Jose remained silent. Dr. Carmen did not ask him any more questions, but she told me that he was very worried about his boss, and that as soon as the elevator doors opened, the guard ran out into the hallway, toward the area where Graziella was probably, with the doctor behind him. As they ran down the hallway, they glanced at the offices on either side, but everything seemed closed until they stopped in front of the double doors of the intensive care area. Jose told his partner on the radio to be alert because he was going to come in. The doctor told me that the guard turned to look at her and with a gesture of his hand indicated that she should wait there. He pulled out the gun he had in his waistband, took a lamp out of his jacket, pushed the door gently with his shoulder, and went into the room. Dr. Carmen told me that those minutes of waiting seemed like an eternity to her, because she was really very worried about Graziella. So she began to despair. So without thinking much, she pushed the door a little to find out what was happening. But she didn't go in. She just poked her head out. But she almost pulled it out immediately. An intense, rotten smell made her nauseous that almost made her vomit. She began to breathe deeply through her nose to calm down. Once that sensation passed, she looked for a face mask that she had in her gown bag and put it on. She pushed the door again. Even so, the smell was penetrating. She tried not to think about it. This time she did go in, but she stayed a few steps from the door, stretching her neck, trying to locate the guard. But the room was very dark. It seemed strange to her that Jose had not turned up the main switch for the lights that was on one side of the same door. She turned around towards the switch and turned it up. The click of the button was heard with a great echo, because there was a very deep silence in the room. The whole area, not a single one of the lamps turned on. He told me that he tried several times. He turned the switch up and down, but nothing. It seemed that all the lamps had burned out, because all the other devices continued working normally. He looked for his phone in the pockets of his lab coat to send a message to Miguel, the maintenance manager, so that he could check it first thing tomorrow morning. Until that moment, he realized that he had forgotten his cell phone in his office. He turned around. He confessed to me that he was a little scared seeing the room in darkness. He tried to relax. He waited a few more minutes to see if he saw the guard or Graziella, but nothing. Finally, he decided to look for them and began to walk between the beds in the room. Some had the curtain that separates them drawn to give a little privacy to the patients. He told me that he began to feel very cold, that he was even shaking. But he continued walking, checking between the beds. Dr. Carmen did not want to contradict her in anything she had just told her, because she thought that she had probably hallucinated when she had convulsed, or when her brain had lacked oxygen. Graziella stood up and gave the doctor a big hug while thanking her again for having saved her life. She still insisted that she leave there as soon as she had the chance. Carmen told her that she would do it so that she would leave in peace. Graziella turned around and left her office. It was the last time she saw her. She has not heard from her since then. and although she tried not to give much importance to the story she had just heard, from that day on she began to have very intense and recurring nightmares with that demon woman that Graciela had told her, to the point that it began to affect her physical and mental health. So one of her aunts, Lola, her mother's sister, sent her to Doña Mariana, the healer. That's how Dr. Carmen finished telling me Graciela's story. Night. I was speechless from the impression. In the middle of that silence, my cell phone alarm went off. It was 10 minutes to 3 in the morning. As head nurse, I had to make my routine rounds through all the areas. Much to my regret, I had to get up. While I told Dr. Carmen, as a joke, not to go away, that I would be back quickly, I knew beforehand that she didn't get out until 6 in the morning, just like me. I remember that she looked at me for a moment over her glasses while pretending to be annoyed, and returned her gaze again to the screen of her computer. I grabbed my clipboard with my report sheets that were on her desk, and while I was reviewing them, I headed towards the exit of the office. At that time, I started my journey from the 4th floor down, from the intensive care area, and ended precisely on the ground floor in the emergency area with Dr. Carmen. As I walked down the main hallway, I felt a very cold breeze all over my body. It even made my skin crawl. I got a very intense chill. It seemed strange to me. In the hospital, they avoided this type of air currents, but I thought that he had been influenced by the story that the doctor had just told me. I tried not to give it importance. I shrugged my shoulders and continued walking and checking my papers. But as soon as I advanced a few steps, I had the feeling that someone or something was behind me. It is like when you feel that someone or something is staring at you, but you cannot see it. At the moment, I was scared, but I remembered that it could be Diana or Jimena, one of my fellow nurses who work with me on this shift. I stopped and slowly turned back. The hallway was completely empty. There was no one around. The doors to the offices and consulting rooms on the sides were closed. Everything seemed calm and silent. Then several of the ceiling lights began to turn on and off, as if they were short-circuiting. It didn't seem so strange to me. It happened sometimes. I looked up to see which ones were failing, so I could report them to maintenance. I kept looking up. It seemed like they were flashing in sequence, and when they did, you could hear a moan or a lament. There was something that wouldn't let me take my eyes off the lights until I heard a very loud bang on a glass. I quickly looked down at one of the windows of the offices that were a few steps away from me. Then I thought I saw the face of a young woman peeking through the curtains. I was very scared. I jumped back. The muscles in my arms and legs became very hard. I almost screamed. That face disappeared, just as I saw it. That made me doubt. I thought I had imagined it. I still thought that I had been very influenced by Dr. Carmen's story, so I tried to calm down. I took several deep breaths. I felt my muscles relax. Now calmer, I slowly approached the window of that office and looked inside between the folds of the curtain. And nothing. There was absolutely no one there. I was angry with myself for being such a coward. I finished writing down the number of the broken lamps, and just at that moment, a sweet, very intense aroma reached me. It did not surprise me at all. Some of the relatives of our patients managed to bring flower arrangements in their sick ones, but that aroma had something very familiar. It seemed familiar to me. I tried to remember the place where I had smelled it before. But as hard as I tried, I couldn't remember where or when. What I did realize was that the more I breathed it, the more overwhelmed I felt, to the point where I began to feel nauseous and my stomach began to turn. That's how I got to Mrs. Mariana's house. She and Dr. Carmen laid me on my back, straightened me up, and gave me a glass to drink. It was a very bitter liquid. I had to spit it out several times. My tongue and throat felt like they were burning, and my stomach was turning, but they didn't stop until I drank it all. Then Dr. Carmen hugged me from behind and held me like that, while Mrs. Mariana pressed her thumb against my forehead, while she prayed over and over again, something that I didn't understand. At times, I felt like I was going to vomit, and other times, I felt like I couldn't breathe until I lost consciousness, and when I opened my eyes, I was face down, on the floor, or on the bed. There came a time when I couldn't open them anymore. I only felt my arms and legs being squeezed tightly because my body was shaking, convulsing. I really thought I was going to die there. I don't know how much time passed when finally my body became still, calm. And although I didn't know how much time passed, I was still calm. And although I could open my eyes. I heard in my dreams the voice of Mrs. Mariana praying with great devotion. When I finally woke up, I was in my bed, in my house. Dr. Carmen was passing a wet cloth over my forehead. She smiled at me when she saw me. I didn't know what to say to her. I tried to get up, but I still didn't have strength in my arms. She gently stopped me from trying, while she told me that now everything would be okay, that I should try to rest, that she would stay to take care of me. After a few weeks, I was able to recover almost completely, although I still have some scars and ailments, but apparently nothing serious. What I have not been able to avoid completely are the nightmares with that demon woman, as Doña Mariana called her. And sometimes I still wake up agitated and crying in the early mornings, but it has diminished. I return to work, but in another hospital, and every 2 weeks, without fail, I visit Dr. Carmen at her home, to whom I will be eternally grateful for having saved my life.